Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for the invitation as well. I just wanted to say to Andy, I live in Lancaster, and in Lancashire our libraries are being decimated, so I just wish we could take City Read and transplant it to the best of the country.
It's possible, it's all possible.
Well, it should happen, it needs to happen. So it's going to be sort of this is slightly different, and I'm from an academic background, and I teach English literature at MMU in Manchester. And what I'm going to be talking to you about in the next 20 minutes, I consider myself a literary geographer. So all my research is about the relationship between literature, particularly poetry, and the places in which we live and the spaces through which we move. And a lot of my work has been on the relationship between literary text and digital mapping technologies. So what I'm just going to do for the next 20 minutes or so is a bit of a romp through the evolution of digital literary mapping in academic context over maybe about the past 10 years or so, just to give you a sense of the different ways in which academics and literary critics have been using these technologies to think about the reading of literary texts. And as it will become clear as we get to the end of the talk, it actually does map back onto the Poetic Places app, because I'm very interested about sort of reading on location. So we'll come back to that in a minute. But I just wanted to begin with a couple of quotations, and these are from two cultural geographers. And the first is from the late Dennis Cosgrove, and it's from 2008, and that is, mapping is a creative process of inserting our humanity into the world and seizing the world for ourselves. I just wanted to sort of flag that up at the start, because I think that emphasis on creativity is really important. I think I might come back to that right at the end. So that's the first quotation. The second is from a more recent article by a group of geographers, the main author, someone called James Ash. This was an article published last year, in which they say the production of geographical knowledge is now thoroughly reliant upon and mediated through the digital. So this is an article which is open access and available online, and it is about the way in which our geographical experiences and geographical knowledge is mediated, not exclusively, but largely through the digital. That's their argument. So I want to just have these in the back of my head as I go through the next 20 minutes. So I just wanted to begin with a couple of sort of thoughts about this term literary geography, in case it's not sort of familiar to you. And it's nothing new, this idea of literary geography, and obviously the tradition of thinking about the relationship between literature and place is a very long and very rich one. But that term literary geography, a lot of academics trace it back to a book which was published in 1904 by someone called William Sharp. And that began as a series of magazine articles, which were then brought together into this book called Literary Geography. And it's full of illustrations and full of little maps. And basically each chapter in that book tries to link a writer with the places they lived in, and also the places that they represented. So there's a chapter on Scots and Scotland, and there's a chapter on the Lake District, thinking about Wordsworth and the relationship with the Lake District. So it's a work of literary tourism, really. It's about making those connections between text and places, but it's also trying to encourage people to go to those places, and this goes back to the app, and like I say, we'll come back to that later on. So that was at the beginning of the 20th century, and then another important moment, I think, in terms of literary geography came in the 70s and 80s. And this was a moment when geography departments were really becoming increasingly interested in cultural geography, thinking about cultural artifacts and what they told us in terms of geography and geographical knowledge. And a lot of geographers at that time became interested in literature and started reading literary texts as providers of geographical information and geographical knowledge. So this is an example of a map of Hardy's Wessex. So there's a lot of geographers who were interested. They were interested in thinking, how can we as geographers use our sort of critical tools as geographers to read these literary texts? And in Hardy's case, how can we think about the way Wessex is constructed as a part real, part imagined territory? How can we as geographers read those writings? And how can we think about the way those writings actually produce our sense of place? So that was happening in the 70s and 80s. I'd argue, though, maybe since the late 1990s, there's been a real explosion in terms of literary geography, and there's been a coming together of the two disciplines, literary studies and geography. And I guess it's for lots of reasons, but one of the main reasons is the so-called spatial turn across the arts and humanities. So in the 1990s in particular, a lot of academics, whether in sort of sociology or literary studies or cultural studies, started engaging with a lot of theories of space and place and landscape, and started applying them to cultural texts or placing them in dialogue with cultural texts. So a book from the 1980s called The Practice of Everyday Life by Michel de Certeau this became like a real sort of go-to text for a lot of literary critics from the late 1990s onwards, with thinking about the literature of space and place. So there was this sort of cross-fertilisation, if you like, of thinking from spatial theorists and thinking about the way in which creative writers represent space, place and landscape. And I think what's happened during this period as well has been that application of spatial theory, but I think what's been more interesting is been the process of collaboration that has emerged over that period. So in universities, I guess the old traditional disciplinary boundaries are being broken down and being dissolved, and there's a lot of interdisciplinary research for lots of reasons. And I think over the past 10 years or so, there's been increased emphasis on geographers and literary critics actually working together. So instead of, we had the situation in the 70s and 80s of geographers reading literary texts from their own disciplinary perspectives, now there's a lot of conversation. So I've set up an open access journal called Literary Geographies, and that journal is made up of an editorial board which contains both geographers and literary critics. So all the time we've got the two disciplines talking to one another, asking each other questions, really sort of interrogating each other's procedures, if you like, when it comes to thinking about the literature of space and place. So if we have that sort of movement towards interdisciplinary literary geography from the late 1990s, I'd argue a substrand of that has been, and a dominant substrand has been literary cartography, thinking about the relationship between literature and maps. And a key moment in this was the publication of a book in the late 1990s by Franco Moretti called The Atlas of the European Novel. And he makes an important move, I think, in critical terms. Instead of just thinking about the maps which you might find in texts or find sort of at the beginning of books, he was actually, as a literary critic, thinking, what happens if I actually create maps based on my reading of literary texts? What if I, as a literary critic, become the creative map maker? And what he does in that book, this is a sort of a published monograph, so it's in book form. And his interest in that book is mapping out key places in the 19th century novel. So on the right here, we've got a map in which he's thinking about the locations of protagonists of Parisian novels and what he calls their objects of their desire. So he's very interested in placing characters within primarily the urban landscape in terms of the 19th century novel. So he's interested in taking novels, locating what happens in those novels, and then thinking, well, what's that tell us actually about the representation of space within those texts? How does the creation of those maps help us pose critical questions about those texts? So for him, and this is crucial, the maps aren't the end point, they're just the beginning of the process, really. So once he's made the maps, he then pulls back and thinks, so what? So what I wanted to do in the time that's left, if that is sort of a key moment in terms of thinking about the relationship between literature and cartography, a lot of sort of academics over the past 10 years or so have drawn upon a lot of Moretti's thinking. Well, I've asked the question, we're living in the digital age, how can we use the tools and the ever-evolving tools of geospatial technologies to think about the relationship between literature and place, and think about what might be meant by literary mapping in the digital age. And I've just co-edited the book, which is coming out later on this year with Routledge, which is about that. It's called Literary Mapping in the Digital Age. And in that book, there's a series of collection of essays, and it's really tracing the evolution of literary mapping over the past 10 years or so. I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the sort of what I think are some of the key features of digital literary mapping, just to give you a sense of how it has changed and where we are now, I think. So one key aspect of the way in which I think literary critics have used digital maps is for what you might call geovisualization. And this is tied in a lot with the attempt to reach out to audiences outside the academy, so to try and engage people. And I think this is a really interesting question for all of us about how maps can provide a portal, if you like, for readers or for users who might not think they're actually interested in the text themselves, but they can find a way to the text through maps. And an example, and there's loads of examples out there, but there's a major project up in Glasgow called Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century, which is all about creating a digital edition of Robert Burns's work. But if you look at their project website, there's a little sort of corner of their website where there are interactive maps. And the Burns scholar, someone called Nigel Leask, has plotted a lot of Burns's movements around the highlands and the borders. And I think what is interesting about that element of the website is that I think he's using it, he's not really interested in maps necessarily. He's interested in plotting Burns' movement through this landscape. But I think he's primarily interested in trying to find ways that users might find a way into Burns's writing. They might not think that they're interested in Burns, but they might be interested in the places that are represented. So, and this is obviously just a PowerPoint, but if you go to the website, you can click on a particular location that Leask has mapped, and then you can pull up the associations with Burns. So he's interested here, I think it was maps, like I say, as a way into thinking about Burns's writing. That project is essentially scholarly, it's creating this scholarly digital edition, but maps, I think it was that part of that attempt to reach out. A second way, the first sort of form of digital literary mapping is about reaching out and about visualising literary texts. There's also been a dominant strand of digital literary mapping which has been about using digital technologies to interpret literary texts. And this was an example of a project I was involved with at my previous university, Lancaster, which was called Mapping the Lakes. And this was funded by the British Academy, and it was basically predicated on the idea that we might take geographic information systems, GIS technology, and use that to read literary texts. So what we did in that project was very sort of discrete, very small project, and we essentially mapped out 2 texts and 2 accounts of Torn Through the Lake District, which takes us back to the video we've just seen. So it was an account of Torn Through the Lake District by Thomas Gray from 1769, and it was an account from Samuel Taylor Coleridge in the summer of 1802. And we mapped those 2 texts. Well, I digitised the text and geotagged the text, so I ended up trying to locate, so think about the geographical locations, geo-reference them, and we ended up producing a whole series of maps of GIS based on that process of geo-referencing. But for me, I think the most interesting thing that emerged from that project was also the limitations of this as a form of responding to a text. So it made me really think about the act of place naming within writing. Also made me think, what do we do with a place name reference which can't be geolocated, where the writer might have just got it wrong, or is used in a completely imagined place. So I was really interested in the way in which the technology, rubbing up against the limitations of the technology, if you like, where the technology wanted this geo-locatable data, but the text wasn't quite providing it with that. So from that project, we wrote a lot about digital literary mapping as a process, a way of close reading these couple of texts. And in that project as well, it was also in relatively early days of Google Earth, so we linked Google Earth and Google Maps with the actual text. So we were interested in the way in which readers would navigate their way through the website. So some readers might begin with the actual maps, and some other readers actually begin with the text themselves. So there was 2 ways into thinking about that relationship between literature and space. The other thing I'll just say about that with the project we did, we also created mood maps of the 2 texts that we looked at. And in order to create these mood maps, to think about how do you actually represent the emotional response to the landscape by these 2 writers, the technology that we used, and this was a project which was done in collaboration with a digital humanist, he was basically saying, well, actually you need data. You need actually data in order to produce these maps. So what we ended up doing in this particular project, and this was partly working with students as well, we created almost like a table of emotional responses to the landscape, where 1 was a negative response and 10 was a positive response. And we used this, created almost like this sort of quantitative analysis of these literary texts. And for me, this was very strange and went up against all my training as a literary critic. And a lot of people, when we started talking about this, sort of had this sceptical look. But over time, there's been increasing interest, since this project was sort of unfolded, there's been increasing interest across literary studies in using quantitative analysis for thinking about literary texts. And I'll give you another example. So a second strand of digital literary mapping, the previous one, which was interested in interpretation, was about zooming in on the particularities of texts. Another big strand has been thinking about big data. So suddenly we can access sort of vast corpora of text that we could never access in the past. So what can we do with this information? How can we handle it? So there's a lot of projects which are obviously using big data and trying to macro-analyse it, as an American critic, Matthew Jopkins, puts it. So trying to think about the large-scale patterns that emerge when you have a large body of text and then ask questions of that large body of digital text. And there's been a lot of projects which are thinking about those sort of the use of big data in spatial terms. So a project which is also at Lancaster, which has emerged from the previous Mapping the Lakes project, is one called Spatial Humanities. And that project is predicated on the idea of creating a digital corpus of Lake District writings, quite a large corpus, and then pulling back and thinking, actually, what does this large body of writings tell us about the way in which the representation of the Lake District has evolved over time? We've got this quite sort of sizable corpus of writings. How can we start thinking about spatial patterns? How have writers, how have their response to the Lake District changed over time? How have they been find themselves gravitating towards particular places? Has there been trends over decades? These sort of large-scale questions have begun to emerge from this use of big spatial data. Another key area which is emerging is the sort of practice of deep mapping. And Joanna is in the audience, who can just say hello, who's from Lancaster University and is working on this deep mapping project at Lancaster University. And I think this is part of a sort of wider interest in deep mapping. And I think it started mainly in the States, where a lot of American digital humanists, really influenced by the French situationists, and also the writing of the splendidly named William Least Heat Moon, who has this book, Prairie Earth, which is a deep mapping of Kansas County. So they're interested in actually thinking what happens if you take quite a small area of land and actually try and digitally map everything within that particular area of land. So thinking about the literary texts that have represented that particular landscape, also thinking about the paintings that have been used to represent that landscape, maybe the use of audio material, maybe geological information, everything really. So I think that in some ways that's problematic, this idea, because this is open-ended. The deep map can never be fully realised because there's always something more to map about a place. But that's one way in which digital literary mapping in academia anyway is moving. Can I just check how long I've got left? Is it 2 minutes? Okay, thank you. So, yeah, it's fine. So, I just wanted to end there by saying, actually, one of the things that is really interesting me at the moment, and this connects with Poetic Places, is actually the way in which mobile technologies are being used within digital literary mapping, and the way in which mobile technologies, and we've already touched upon this, but are actually taking readers out of spaces like this, out of the libraries, taking our students out of the libraries and out of the seminar rooms, and actually back it into the landscapes that are being represented. So I'm interested in this sort of reconnection, if you like, between the practice of reading, the literature of place and space, and those material landscapes which are being represented. And I'm not alone in this, so there's a project in Bristol called Romantic Bristol, which is at the University of Bristol, which is asking these very questions. Very interested in the sort of the act of walking in that project, and the way that walking can be seen as a form of the relationship between walking and reading. And there's also a project in Edinburgh called Lit Long, which was previously called Palimpsest. And again, very similar, interested in the way in which literary Edinburgh has been layered over time, and then interested in actually, if we use our mobile devices and think about these texts in the landscape, how does that actually change the very act of reading? So I just wanted to conclude by citing the work of Robert Macfarlane, and I make it clear, I find there's much to admire in Robert Macfarlane's writing, so this isn't a bit of Macfarlane bashing, but in his last book, Landmarks, I sort of continually worry about some of his statements about technology. And in that book, which I'm sure is familiar to some of you, he's very interested in the relationship between language and landscape, and he's trying to forge this re-enchantment or this reconnection between ourselves as embodied beings and the material landscape around us. And he's very interested in the way that literature and the way that literary language can help sort of foster that relationship. But I think as a byproduct of that, there's a technophobia running through his writing in that particular book anyway. And this is just one quotation where he's drawing upon the philosophy of Martin Heidegger and is worrying about sort of the disconnectedness that is being generated by mobile technologies. And maybe this appeared in The Guardian when there was an extract from Landmarks. He worries about changes to the Oxford Children's Dictionary and the way that BlackBerry, as in sort of fruit, had been replaced with BlackBerry with a capital B. Actually, do BlackBerries still exist, as in the mobile technologies? Or do they still? Anyway, so he uses that as an example, the way that our language of the natural world is being eroded and being replaced by the language of technology, and he sees this as being symptomatic of the human condition, if you like. But although I'm not unsympathetic to that as an idea, when you sort of give students, for example, that passage from Macfarlane's Landmarks, it just doesn't speak to them at all. They just can't conceive of this idea that they will just put down their devices and just engage with the hetero. It's just not the way that they see themselves as being in the world. So I just wanted to end with a sort of saying, for me, I think actually we need to, and it goes back to the quotation that I used at the beginning of this talk, we need to think about actually the way in which digital technologies can help sort of mediate the relationship with the natural world or the urban environment, and think about the way in which digital technologies can sort of forge this reconnection with the material landscapes in which we find ourselves. And actually, I wonder then whether it's actually not by abandoning digital technologies, but it's actually through digital technologies we might actually reach that sort of stage of re-enchantment which Macfarlane, I think quite rightly, is longing for. So sorry that's a bit of a romp through, but yeah, thank you very much for listening.